Tim, you are going to tell us your worst story from your barber. What did your barber mess you up?
My worst experience with a barber was when I was... So I had just started growing a mustache. So I was very attached to it. I felt like it was introducing me to adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was like, I really like that. If you want to offend me, just try to trim it wrong.
Okay.
So I go, this guy is just giving me a haircut. I've told you, to trim it a bit. It wasn't even much, it was just trimming kidogo. Then he tells me something that's funny. Then I laugh.
Oh, no.
Then the machine goes like, one side, the entire of it is gone. I'm like, what have you done, man? He's like, it's not me. You laughed.
I was about to say, I don't think that's 100% on your barber. Surely. You're supposed to know that you're about to laugh. And
these days, you cannot make me laugh when you're giving me a haircut, yeah? So I remember that time, and I was so pissed. I wasn't sure to be angry at myself or the barber because, geez, what have you done?
I know.
At that time, you're feeling like it's your pet project. It makes you feel so grown, yeah?
That's so funny. I guess mine is kind of similar, but not quite. Mine, I remember at a certain point in life, my ambition was to just grow sideburns like this.
Okay.
This isn't me. I never really grow out a beard or anything like that. But at a certain point, it would come like this, like this.
Yeah, you're forcing issues,
connect, kind of.
Yeah.
So I was like, you know what?
Yeah.
Let's do it. And the guys used to do it. I don't know if it's like Usher, like all these R&B guys
it was big to have a string, almost like a string.
So I used to do it and it would connect. Sometimes it was like really thin, but I'm like, it's there.
Yeah.
Then one time I went to the barber and I told him specifically, like, line it up like da.
Yeah.
What? Zoom. He just removed it. Like, I was like, did this guy not hear what I said?
Did you pay him?
I was pissed. But what am I going to do now? I had to pay him. But I paid him so, like, in my mind, I was like, I'm not coming back to this guy.
Terrible experiences,
Yeah, so, but anyway, I guess we move on.
We
I
move
like the
on.
goatee now.
Yeah,
so this one now, I tell my barber, bro, chill. Even the gray hairs, because every time he goes, like, he'll get, like, scissors and try to cut,
take
like...
them off.
And I'm like, no, bro, relax.
Yeah,
like,
I'm panicky.
So here's how to cut them off, but I'm like, bro, just chill. Anyway, shout out Julius, my barber. Welcome back. This is the full scale episode. I am your host for episode 3, Adrian Twatwa, and I'm joined by my co-host, Timothy Mukiti. Timothy, how are you doing today?
Doing very well.
Yeah?
Fantastic, yeah. Yeah, like excited to be back.
Got good energy.
Episode 3, yeah.
Episode 3. Amazing. God is good. Okay, so today, what are we talking about? Today, we're talking about formation structures for startups. Right?
Exactly.
So last episode, just to recap, intro, we sort of told you who we are, what we're about, why we're doing this. Episode 2, we set the scene. What are startups? Differences between startups and other businesses. What sets startups apart? All those sort of really good insights. Go check out episode 2 if you haven't. So today we're now talking about, okay, you now know what a startup is. You want to get started. How do you get started? How do you form? How do you register? What are all these structures? So today's episode, I think, is a bit more legal or heavier on the legal. But I think, again, we're going to try as much as possible to make this as accessible for any viewer, whether or not you have a legal background or if you're familiar with these concepts or not.
Yeah.
So, Tim, maybe you can get us started. So I want to start a startup. What are the different structures that are available? How can I structure it? How do I form it? Like, what's available to me? What are the options?
Well, there are various options that you have as a founder or founders of a startup in terms of structuring your startup. And that by structuring, we mean giving it a legal character, giving this startup a life and a legal character or a form of existence, so that you have a vehicle for which you can pursue your novel idea and give it the ability to scale up. And some of these will depend on the jurisdiction that your startup is operating in, because of course they're regulated by the local laws. These structures, every jurisdiction has particular laws that regulate the structure that you can take and what that particular structure means. There are, of course, similarities, a lot of similarities across multiple jurisdictions, but there are nuances as well. with each and every specific jurisdiction on how that structure will look like, what obligations and liabilities it can have, its existence, whether it's perpetual, and things like, what you can do with it and how it moves, how it makes its decisions. Yeah. So this the about 4 general structures that apply in a startup. One of them is a sole proprietorship.
Okay.
You could be a founder, you're a single founder, and you decide to set up a sole proprietorship. The second one could be a partnership. You could get into a partnership with your founder, or even there are single partnerships, depending on jurisdictions.
Okay.
And you decide to set it up in that manner. Then the third one could be a limited liability partnership. And of course, like I mentioned, they do have general characteristics, but they might have some nuances, maybe a few changes and nuances depending on each and every jurisdiction. And the fourth one is a limited liability company, or what some people can call limited liability corporation. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, depending on jurisdiction, but they tend to have almost similar characteristics, across jurisdictions. There might be a few nuances here and there, but yeah. So those are the 4 broad categories of the structures that you can take.
Awesome. So you've mentioned, just to recap, what I've understood is in each jurisdiction, in each country, the law, or historically the courts, have decided that this is an entity that exists under the law.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Different entities are companies, sole proprietorships, partnerships, etc. And you can set up your startup as any one of these, depending on the jurisdiction and other factors that we're going to go into. You mentioned limited liability partnership, limited liability company. What is that? When we say limited liability, what are we talking about?
Well, when we talk about limited liability, what we're talking about is, well, let's even start from the structure itself. The structure you obtain, the entity that you have, has obligations, will get into debts, will have obligations that he needs to take care of. And limited liability is basically a limitation to the extent in which the obligations and the liabilities of the entity can affect you as a founder, as a shareholder, or as a partner.
Okay.
So it's basically the limitation as to what obligations, to extent of which the obligations can and the debts of this particular entity can apply to you. So maybe to perhaps take an example of a company. A company could be a limited liability company, could be limited in 2 ways. It could be limited by shares, or it could be limited by guarantee. And when you say it's limited by shares, basically your liability, how much liability you owe the company, or how much you can be liable to the company's obligations and debt, is limited to how much guarantee you've given, if it's limited by guarantee. And by guarantee, we mean that you guarantee to, you provide a guarantee for the company. It's limited to how much guarantee you've given, or it's limited to how much shareholding you have and whether it's fully paid up or not. So if, for example, I have 100 shares in a company that are not fully paid up, I'm still liable to up to the point of fully paid up shares for that particular company. So that's the concept of limitation, that the liability for the obligations and debts would be limited to a particular level.
Got you. Just to take that a bit further, so I have 100 shares in the company. Say I've paid 1,000 shillings for those shares. Say I've fully paid up, and the company has a debt of 100 million Kenya shillings, and it's not able to pay any of that money. What's my liability? In this very vague example, of course, assuming everything is constant. What would my liability be, and how would the limitation of liability affect me there?
Sorry, you've said you have 100 shares of how much? What's the value?
Say I've paid 1,000 total. So it was like 10
so it's
each.
100 shares of 10 shillings each.
Correct.
Or even $10 if you're used to use that example.
Correct.
Your liability is limited to that 1,000 that you're paid.
Got you.
And assuming that you haven't paid it up all, then your liability is limited up to the extent of what can be called what you haven't really made payment for.
Got you. Perfect. So essentially it gives you cover in that the entity that you've invested in, the that you own shares in, or that you're a part of as a partnership, in the case of a limited partnership, it's a standalone entity. It has personhood, or it has life under the law, such that it has its own liabilities, and you as a shareholder, you're not on the hook for those liabilities. You're limited in your liability up to the amount that you've put in, or up to the amount that you owe in terms of your shareholding or your partnership interest.
Exactly. And that's when this particular entity is limited in liability. So if you're in a partnership that is not limited liability, then of course the obligations and debts of that entity, the partnership, would still come and attach to you as a partner. So it's for those entities that of course have recognition that they are limited in their liability.
Awesome. And I think that dovetails quite well into, I think, the next topic we wanted to touch on, which is some of the pros and cons, right?
Yeah, sure. Maybe you can let us know a bit more about the pros and cons of the structures for each of this.
Happy to. So, I mean, I think you've already touched on one. So let's maybe talk about limitation of liability first, right? When you invest in a company, say as a shareholder, or you purchase a partnership interest in a limited partnership, or you're a sole proprietor and this entire company, you owe, this entire sole proprietorship is yours. You want to have some sort of peace of mind as to how much you are ever going to owe. Because if this entity has a life of its own under the law, and it has been seen to do something, and it has a debt or an obligation, it's good for you to know how much you're exposed by those actions.
The extent of your exposure.
Exactly. So limitation of liability is really key. So in the example of a sole proprietorship, you're pretty exposed. You're fully exposed in that the sole proprietorship is almost it's almost another version of you, right? It's just you are the sole proprietorship. The sole proprietorship is you. You are the one directing the company, the entity. You're the one who makes all the decisions. So it's pretty quick to move. You can decide today we're going to pivot and do this different thing. But you're also the one on the hook. If there's liabilities that are owed by the sole proprietorship, you are fully exposed to that. You have unlimited liability.
Exactly.
So that liability flows through the company up to you, which is that's something that you really need to.
Through the entity, because it's not a company. Yeah.
So it's a very I think we often say company when we're referring to any entity, right?
Yes.
It's sort of like a blanket statement, and I'm guilty of that as well. But good catch. So I'd say the limitation of liability also applies in the sense of a partnership. So if you're in a general partnership, your liability is general. You again have unlimited liability. Whatever the liability is of the partnership, you take on that liability as well. Whereas if you're in a limited partnership, specifically if you're a limited partner, I guess we'll cover that as well. If you're in a limited liability partnership, you are limited to the extent, again, that you've paid, or that you have to pay up for your partnership interest. So same thing applies for a limited liability company. Very similar. So shareholders are not exposed to general liability. I think the concept comes from how much control do you have over what the entity is doing. So again, if you're a general partner in a partnership, you are typically the one who's going about the day-to-day running of the entity. The best example, I think, is in the private equity space, whereby most of the private equity funds generally are structured as limited partnerships, in the sense that there is a general partner and several, or 1 to 2, or however many limited partners. The limited partners are simply investors. They are passive in that all they do is commit and say, I'm going to put up this much money in the entity. And that's it. If you need anything else from me, I mean, there's very little else that limited partners need to do in the limited partnership structure. The general partner, on the other hand, in the private equity space, they're the ones now responsible for going out and finding the deals, making sure that the deals work out, paying people's money back, making them money. That's sort of how it ends up working. So that's, I think, within the lens of limited liability, how it cuts across the different entities. But so you can see, I guess, the pros for the sole proprietorship is you can do everything you want, but you're also on the hook for everything. From a tax perspective, I think that's another one maybe we can highlight. Similar to the liability, in a sole proprietorship, the taxes, they sort of flow through to you as the end recipient. So if money comes to the sole proprietorship, it's not taxed at the sole proprietorship level. That money then goes through the entity to you as the ultimate beneficial owner, and then you are taxed at your individual tax rate. So that helps from a tax perspective because you don't have to pay tax twice. You don't have to pay tax when it gets to the sole proprietorship and then again when it gets to you. Similarly, for partnerships, generally the money flows through the partnership and it's a flow through entity for tax purposes.
Yeah,
so
tax transparent.
Exactly.
Really, the tax goes through to the partners.
Specifically. So it goes right through and you receive your money without having to pay any other tax. Companies, though, limited liability companies or any other company or otherwise, there's a tax hit, there's a tax event, the money that the moment that money hits the company. So at that point, so if you imagine money coming in from an investment through the company up to you as a shareholder as a dividend or something,
yes,
the money gets taxed when it gets to the company at the whatever the corporate income, the corporate tax rate is. Then it comes up to you, and again it's taxed. So just something to consider there. So that's why you find a lot of private equity funds, VC funds structured as partnerships, right? Because then the taxes flow through, and they don't get double taxed in that way. I mean, partnerships, another advantage is generally you have other people. So if we were to start a partnership, I know I can rely on Tim. Tim can rely on me, and we can make decisions together. We can pool funding and resources. If you're in a sole proprietorship, it's really tough because it's just you, right? It's just you. You can't really take on investors in equity because you own the whole thing. And if you pass away or something happens to you, odds are the sole proprietorship is also done because it really ends with you. Where partnerships, someone can take over your interest and the entity can continue. Same with your shareholding in a company. So it's sort of different things for different entities for different needs. Different regulations apply to the different entities. So all of this is just to give you a general sense as to the various pros and cons of each of these entities. But at the end of the day, the most important thing I think is where you're sitting and what you need to accomplish, and to also always talk to a legal advisor. Talk to legal counsel about these types of things. Don't take our word for it, because this is not legal advice.
Yeah, this is not legal advice. I mean, we like to tell people this is not legal advice because your specific situation,
will
especially
vary.
when you're setting up, will vary depending on what objectives you hope to achieve.
Yep.
Like you've mentioned, if you set up as a limited liability company or limited liability corporation, it becomes much easier to fundraise, because if an investor or a funder is coming in, to get equity, whether it's preferred shareholding or it's ordinary shareholding, they will know what they're coming and getting. That of course would not be so easy in a case of a sole proprietorship, because it's almost like loaning you, really, because what are we getting if we're investing?
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. So the thing is, I think, of course, it's essential to understand exactly what you hope to achieve. Again, like if your plan is to start this startup with a goal of exiting, because not all founders have the same goal. The goals vary. Some of them want to stay in it for the long haul, grow with it and be in it for the long haul. Other founders want to be able to exit at some point. If you're going to be exiting, if that is your goal, then the structure you adopt, would determine how easy it's going to be for you to exit. For example, if you want to exit in a limited liability company, you can transfer all your shareholding and you've basically exited.
Yeah.
Same with if you want to list at a securities exchange as an option of exiting. That limited liability company will give you will make it easy for you to exit through the securities exchange through an IPO or So it will depend on what you hope to achieve, what your intentions are as a founder. Again, like you've mentioned about the tax considerations, those are very important ones to look at, because the structure you adopt will, it depends on how you want the tax to be treated. Do you want it to be tax transparent, or do you want to be, tax transparent in the case of like partnerships, where the income is taxed on the partner level, or would you want to have it, to have it like a company? It really depends. And again, also it's good to add that also the structures and even the tax impact of the structure you take may vary depending on some jurisdictions, because there are some jurisdictions that seem to have adopted a model where they have limited liability companies that almost behave like partnerships in terms of tax transparency. And it's a legal thing, it's a local law thing, but mostly of course, limited liability companies will not have the same characteristic with partnerships.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And that very perfectly leads us into I think the next bit, which is so where do you go to set up your company? You see, every jurisdiction is different, everything varies, different regulators approach things differently, the laws are different in different places. So how exactly to go about picking where to set up, right? Where to set up your startup specifically. So let's talk about maybe in the continent. So a few jurisdictions I think that are worth highlighting. And of course, again, do your own research, talk to your legal
Talk to your
advisors.
lawyer.
Talk to people.
Or talk to us, actually.
But within the continent specifically, I think it again varies, right? It depends, just like most good lawyerly answers. They start with it depends. So
and it truly does.
you're starting up your business, your startup. Where are your operations going to be, right? I think that's a thing to look at. So if my operations are going to be in Nairobi, odds are I'm probably going to want to set up in Nairobi so that I can have a tax ID. I can have all these all the documentation I need, the licensing to go about doing the business that I want to do there. So that's typically important. But then sometimes you might also want to consider, where is your funding going to come from? So your funding might not be coming from Nairobi. It might be coming from the US or from Europe or somewhere else. So in which case, I've seen a lot of startups do the thing where they set up a holding company in
Especially Delaware.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I think it's
popular.
And that one I think we'll get to. That's a business-friendly state, right? A place where the regulators have decided to make the place, the jurisdiction, as attractive for businesses as possible. And
although Elon Musk didn't seem to think that much. He moved from Delaware.
That's a whole episode for another day. But yes, he had issues. But generally speaking, most people find that Delaware is a business-friendly environment. And so when you set up your company there, investors are very open to that because they understand Delaware. Odds are they've already invested in another company that's registered in Delaware. They're familiar with the laws that affect it, how to get, how to repatriate funds into Delaware, all sorts of things. And so especially the tax characteristics and sort of which jurisdiction is more tax friendly. So places like Mauritius end up being really hot for investors because it's a very tax friendly jurisdiction and it has a lot of double tax treaties with other countries, so that if you're doing business in Kenya, but you're holding companies in Mauritius, or the funds are going to end up going to Mauritius, you may not need to get double taxed. You may not need to get taxed in both jurisdictions. But again, it's on a case-by-case basis.
Limitations on this double taxation treaties, how much you can benefit.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important that you need to talk to a tax lawyer.
Exactly. You need to engage and understand exactly how this applies to you and how it can benefit you.
100%.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. So tax, investment friendly, where your money is going to come from, but then also other things, just the investment infrastructure, right? Which could be very basic things like, is there electricity? Is there internet connectivity constantly, right? So you're able to constantly communicate with folks. Good service, good road networks, being able to access the places that you're going to go to. A lot of those, where's the talent that you're seeking that can help you build this type of company. So there are many different things to look out for. A lot of those, I'm sure you can chime in if there are any that I'm forgetting there. But once you've decided all of that, I guess then it's a question of, okay, so where within the continent would be a good place generally for that type of thing? So, I think Kenya, of course, we're here in Nairobi, so we have to shout out Kenya. Kenya is...
it's a very good destination.
Yeah, it's a premier destination for investment. Especially for companies that are just trying to enter the East African or African market. It's a good gateway into the market. So Kenya is usually a good place to start. But other places that have usually ranked pretty highly when it comes to ease of doing business. Mauritius is usually pretty top of the list when it comes to the continent. Just a place where there's strong rule of law, enforcement of contracts. So if you do enter into a contract with someone, you know that it's going to be enforced by the courts, which I think is super important. Investment friendly laws and taxes and sort of tax legislation. So Mauritius is one that usually ranks pretty highly. Rwanda, Kigali specifically, is also getting up there. They've implemented reforms that allow you to now basically open a company within like a day. So you can register a company and have it operational all in 24 hours. Barring different circumstances, but that's I think a huge leap compared to some other places on the continent where it's really tough to get started. Kigali is really trying to shape itself as an investment-friendly destination.
Yeah.
Similarly, Zanzibar
Yeah,
Oddly,
what's coming up in Zanzibar?
they've started. It's called, they're dubbing themselves Silicon Zanzibar. It's basically a private public initiative through, I think, the Ministry of Investment and local stakeholders, and the goal being to make it an investment friendly destination, right? So like you're Mauritius, you think of Mauritius as a place, or Seychelles, or these other places where you can go and you can make investments, taxes will be friendly. I think they have, if you relocate, specifically for fintechs, if you relocate your fintech to Zanzibar, you get like a 10-year tax free on income
Oh,
tax,
really?
something like that. Yeah. Which is very
Okay,
interesting.
that's interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, I
yeah.
mean, of course, look into it, talk to your lawyer, do your research, but it seems like they're also trying to model themselves as a destination. I mean, by the time they're calling themselves Silicon Zanzibar, I think that sort of indicates what they're trying to get at.
Actually, to also add on that point, specifically for Kenya and on a tax basis, there are some benefits you could get, some tax breaks
Okay.
that you can get if you set up in what is called a special economic zone.
Please tell us more.
Yeah. No, we'll delve into more details, but there are specific benefits that you could get.
Yeah.
And that's why it will be essential to, as you're trying to set up the startup, or even along your journey, that sometimes at the early stages of startup, you may not be looking at some of these things a little keenly, but it's important for you because they do affect you in the long run
100%.
when you scale up and when you start to become revenue positive and all that, because some of these things you may not have thought about them earlier, but when now you're revenue positive, then the taxes start to come.
But if you've been watching and listening to the Full Scale podcast, you'll be way ahead on all these things, right?
You should be, honestly. You should be way ahead on some of these things.
So just a plug there to, if you're really enjoying the content, like, subscribe, share the content with your friends. And yeah, that's all I'm gonna do in terms of plugging. I did want to ask you.
Tell a friend.
I did want to ask you a question, which is, since you've mentioned sort of setting up in Kenya and special economic zone and all of this, could you talk to us more, since you're a Kenyan qualified lawyer? We're talking about Kenya. How would you go about setting up a business here? Registering. Let's say I have my startup idea. I've done all the things we talked about in the last episode and this episode about making sure you know where you're going. I've talked to my lawyers, talked to my friends, my loved ones. I've decided this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
If I'm starting a company, right? Let's say it's a company or LLC in Kenya. How do I go about that? What's the process like? How long does it take? Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, happy to. So of course, you can even try all the setup structures that we mentioned before in Kenya. But the truth is, a limited liability company is a more ideal vehicle, more popular and more ideal. But again, you still have to explore exactly what you're trying to accomplish. If you're especially setting up as a startup, as a company. So setting up a company, of course, in Kenya specifically, requires you to prepare some statutory documents. And when we say statutory, we mean that these are documents that are required by law. Statutory, you're required by law to have them or to prepare them for purposes of setting up a company. You will, of course, need a shareholder or shareholders. You need a director. You need to develop articles of association of the startup, of the company, really. And you could even adopt the model articles that are provided for under the Companies Act in Kenya. And then of course, there's some specific forms that you have to fill out, statutory forms as well. They're prescribed forms. So once you fill them out, of course, and actually, I need to take it back, because the first step actually is identifying the name of the company.
Okay.
And you need to provide about 3 options of a name,
okay,
to the Registrar of Companies.
Why 3?
Well, they will look through the system to identify whether the name that you've chosen, first of all, whether any other company has such a name or any other registered business, or whether it's closely related to another name that is registered, or whether it's a name that you shouldn't use. Like, for example, you can't call yourself, Government Services Limited or something. You're not government. There are some names you cannot use.
Could be misleading.
Misleading, exactly. Or maybe you cannot have Legal Services Limited. something that is a little regulated.
Mm.
Other considerations, of course, include whether your name is repugnant or it's just not good. You cannot have a name that says Toot Them Limited, yeah. You can't do that, So basically they will review. Of course, you list the names according to your preference, in order of preference. And if your name is available, of course, you get to reserve it. And now go to the next stages of incorporating the company, where you've already reserved the name, and then you prepare the statutory documents, you have your articles of association, and then you register and you get the certificate of incorporation, and you hit the ground running.
And that's it.
Yeah.
How long would you say on average that takes?
About if you have no complications, if your name is not rejected, then you have to come up with other names. If you have no missing information and documents that you're still required to provide, about 10 days.
10 days.
10 days or so, yeah.
Okay.
But if you have issues, it could be longer as you address them.
Yeah.
You just pick a weird name, could be in trouble. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. I think that's a good overview in terms of the different types of structures that exist, where to maybe consider if you're looking on the continent, a few jurisdictions that stand out. But again, considering all the other things we mentioned, where are you based, where are your operations, and all of that.
And where you want to raise money from, especially.
Exactly.
And actually, let me add something else. So you also have to know, depending again on that point of raising capital, there are some jurisdictions that are flagged by investors, simply because perhaps they don't have and flagged, they could be blacklisted or something, because they don't have some strict, they could be used as routes for money laundering or funding criminal activity,
right.
Terrorism and all that. So you also need to really be keen to identify where, in case you want to set up as a holding company in that particular jurisdiction, then you need to know what are some of the encumbrances that jurisdiction may bring you, because it may have a challenge at a future date when you want to fundraise, because they would tell you, we can't fund you if money is going through that jurisdiction, and then coming to the jurisdiction that you operate in.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Sort of know your customer, know your client, KYC and AML, anti-money laundering laws, and being familiar with which jurisdictions are on good lists versus not so good lists. So, it does happen, though, that sometimes things change. So Mauritius has always been a jurisdiction that's business friendly. People recognize as a place to do business. But then they were gray listed a year or so ago, or a little further back. But they went through reforms and did all these things to make sure that they got off of that list. Similarly, I think Uganda was also gray listed. But just knowing which jurisdictions are safe, so that your investors don't get skittish, they don't have any issues, and you're able to make your investments and also exit those investments without raising any red flags or creating issues for yourself. I think that's also important. Good
or
one,
even
good
giving
point.
serious compliance burdens to your... everybody wants to invest, but you don't want to, of course, invest in profitable ventures. But you want to invest in a manner that will give you even more work. You have to keep your radar high.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
It's especially important for the founders to know what particular jurisdictions and the legal framework does to their startups, and the potential for fundraising, as well as for potential for exit.
Got you.
Yeah. You don't want to be in a country where they quickly nationalize everything, or there's risk for nationalizing.
That's another one, right? But those are risks that sort of are really wide, and they tend to come up in different places. But I think knowing where you're going and what you're getting yourself into, understanding the political climate, talking to people who are already invested, who have exited that jurisdiction, I think is pretty important. I think you've sort of set the stage in terms of when you're thinking about where to go, the types of things you can think about to ensure you can maximize your ability to do good business and to get invested and to get investors into your company. I think something else that perhaps people ignore, especially starting out, is the corporate governance angle, which is now, if you're looking at it from the term, which jurisdiction to pick and all of this, which laws apply, that's all well and good. But within your company, once you establish that company, how are you running that company? So corporate governance, it's a huge, huge topic. And I think it's something that we can talk more about in a separate episode, and we will do that. But if you're thinking about it in the most broad terms as a company, there are different stakeholders whose interests you're trying to balance. So first and foremost is your shareholders, right? You need to maximize value for your shareholders, like no matter what. Otherwise, as a company, you're pretty much failing. But your shareholders, you need to maximize value for them. But then you also have your board of directors, who are typically the people who have been put in place by the shareholders. They've been appointed to oversee the operations of the company. Then the board of directors then hires, the employees, the lead, the C-suite, the executives, the managers who are going to then do the actual day-to-day operating of the company. They can then go and staff up and all of that. But so all those layers, you have employees, you have managers, directors, you have shareholders, you have the outside world, right? You have your customers, you have the environment. There's so many people to whom you owe some sort of responsibility. Of course, the first being the shareholders. But in this day and age, we're more and more in a world where corporate governance is at the forefront, in that across that full spectrum, you need to balance all of those different people, those different stakeholders to whom you're beholden, and make decisions and operate your company in a way that is trying to look out for all of them, in a sense. So it's in the way you make decisions, it's in the policies that you have, it's in the construction of your board. So is your board a real board, or is it just my friends and they're just going to rubber stamp everything that I ask them to? Exactly. Or is it a real board of people with diverse backgrounds who, you have a lawyer on there, an accountant, someone who has a tax background, people who can give you different perspectives.
Can add value.
Exactly, depending on what's coming up, and they can check you on each thing that you're doing. Even if you're the CEO and you own all the shares, the board will still ask you, like, is this really what you're supposed to be doing? So those types of having that type of structure in place, having policies, right? Policies for what happens in the workplace, what happens when you're not at the workplace, procedures and how to do things, keeping minutes of meetings, making decisions in board meetings or in shareholder meetings, as opposed to just saying, this is what we're going to do next, right? So a lot of this is a lot of the time enshrined within the law. The law will require you to do some of these things, but going above and beyond, especially early on as a startup, I like to say you should start the way you mean to finish, right? If you don't start with corporate governance at the forefront of what you're doing, odds are you're not going to take it up, 5, 6, 10 years down the line. I mean, you may, but it's because, it's going to be very difficult
to start
and it's because someone else has told
expensive,
you. Yeah, or you're fundraising and your investors are asking you where are the board minutes.
Where are the board minutes? You say we just meet and agree. And you see, when you're running a company or a corporation, or when you're running a startup, you don't want to run the risk of making impeachable decisions. Decisions that cannot stand, or doing your business in a manner that sort of presents you to the risk of not sustaining what you're doing. And the reason why this is important is because some of these compliance requirements are prescribed in law. They're prescribed in law and you need to comply. And it's good for everybody. You're prescribed if you're supposed to pass particular resolutions or keep particular minutes. If you're not keeping them, then you're already having challenges. And then this sort of follows you later, at a stage when you start to fundraise. Because of course, an investor will want to do a due diligence. They will ask you to provide your cap table. They will ask you to provide minutes for your last couple of meetings. They will ask to see a couple of things. And if you don't have this, or you're just explaining your way, in Kenya we say nimi nakusho, it's me telling you.
Just believe.
Just believe, come on, I'm telling you, then that of course might present the challenges to you. And that even ties back to the structure question. Whatever structure you pick for your startup, you need to understand what, first of all, compliance nuances are within that particular structure. What is prescribed in law? What are you required to do? What are the bare minimum? Of course, you always need to go a level higher and do best practice. Be ahead of what is the bare minimum that is required by law, and you're doing best practice. But you need to understand what is required, what decisions you can make and how you can make them, what particular returns you're required to keep under regulation, under law. And that's actually what you can do and cannot do, and what are the thresholds of some decisions. So this ties to basically how you're going to be running the startups, and makes it having a good structure is so important. In fact, feel free to reach out to us, and these are discussions we can have, because I think from experience we've seen situations where a startup now is raising money, but the structures are all over.
Yep.
They don't even remember the shareholders. You ask them who is a shareholder, because maybe there be a founder or two, and then there are other guys who are holding shares, so they don't even know. They say like, okay, that was my roommate, campus and roommate. He's not involved or anything, and then the roommate cannot be found to transfer shares, so that
it becomes quite messy.
It just becomes quite messy.
Having to restructure before an investment is never something
you're under pressure.
anyone wants to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's good to be ahead of the curve.
So I wanted to get to wisdom from the course, but before we do that, the last one I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned sort of articles of association, constitutional documents, all these sort of statutory documents that you need to have in place when you start out, say, a company. We always hear mention of a shareholders agreement, right? Could you speak to that, and how's that different from, your articles of association or something else, and what's the importance of a shareholders agreement?
Yeah, I could just highlight a bit, because I think
we have another episode on that.
The next episode after we'll have, I think it's after this or a couple of episodes down the line. I think we will be discussing the agreements that are common or popular, or that you need to understand that for a startup. But I think I can highlight two agreements here for purposes of this conversation. One, of course, you would have a shareholders agreement, which is a private agreement between the shareholders on one part of the company, and the company and the shareholders, sort of setting obligations and between among each of the parties. And it's key difference. First of all, it's key difference from what you would call from articles of association, because there might be overlaps. There will be actually overlaps because some of the things like quorum for meetings, what decisions can pass by what majority, reserved matters. Reserved matters wouldn't be in the articles, but some of these items that would be in articles would overlap with what is in shareholders agreement. But articles of association is a statutory document. It's required by law, and it's a public document. So there might be other items that you parties, one of the nuances of a shareholders agreement. There might be other items that shareholders want to agree among each other or the company, like obligations on how soon or how frequently you share financial statements, financial numbers, management accounts, how often, and what should be contained there. Appointment of, you perhaps want to have a bit more nuance around appointment of auditors.
Or, for example, if we have a disagreement as shareholders, we're 50-50 shareholders, and
how do we resolve
we can't move forward, what do we do?
Exactly.
Or if I want to sell my shares, can I just go sell to anyone, or should I first sell them to you as the other shareholder? Those issues,
Exactly. So that's one of the agreements that shareholders can get into. That almost there are a lot of overlaps with articles of association, but they're complementary to each other, the two documents actually. And it does help to have shareholders agreement, because you set your relationship a little more clearly. But at the very initial stage, when you're setting up the startup, it's actually good for parties to have the founders to have a founders agreement, which would then be providing, sort of setting the framework of your relationship as founders. What are the expectations? Basically, how is your relationship going to be governed? Because like I think as we mentioned in our previous episode, part of the journey of the startup is that you will have to iterate a lot, and you will have to be dynamic. You need to be agile to basically keep changing things and as you go. Because of that dynamism, it's good to sort of have an understanding of who does what and how we can do it and what we expect from each other, so that you're not always having meetings that could be emailed because of things that you perhaps did not contemplate earlier. But like I've mentioned, we will have a deep dive on the agreements in a couple of episodes. So please be on the lookout for that.
I think that's the founders agreement is a really good point, and it's very apropos of what's happening right now. So, for example, with OpenAI, I don't know if you've seen this story. So, OpenAI, the pioneers sort of in the AI space at the moment, the ones who give you ChatGPT, Sora, sort of all these different products. They are, one of their founders initially was Elon Musk. Elon Musk left. There was, it's a long history. I won't go through all of it, but he left at some point. But in his mind, there was a founders agreement, which was that OpenAI should be a non-profit, and its goal is basically to deliver artificial intelligence to the world, but in a safe way and to keep it open, right? It's right in the name, OpenAI. So open source, anyone can access what the building blocks of this AI are, etc. Elon Musk recently has filed a lawsuit against OpenAI, basically claiming that they violated the founders agreement because OpenAI is not open. You can't go find the source code. Like, you can't go and see what the weights and everything underneath the AI of OpenAI. That's not accessible. And also, it's now pretty much a for-profit enterprise, right? Microsoft made an investment, etc. So Elon Musk, for many reasons, decided to sue them. And the founders agreement would be the thing that you would refer to really at that point to say, did they violate this or not? Unfortunately for Elon Musk, there was no founders agreement. There were like emails saying what they generally want to do.
Yep.
So it's going to be an interesting lawsuit to see how that plays out.
How that's under. It could be a good lesson for a lot of founders. I mean,
so very important. So you see, even the Elon Musks of the world make these mistakes.
Right? Of course. The journey is. It's just mistakes do happen sometimes, but keeping going. But at least avoid the mistakes that should be obvious. The ones that you should keep away from. Good
wisdom. Speaking of wisdom, you want to give us some wisdom from the course?
One take for me is how usually sometimes it's on two things. So when you play golf, there are days you will play well and you'll be very happy with yourself. You'll get good shots. The putts just behave.
I know those days.
Yeah, exactly.
They're few and far between, but I know them.
Yeah, exactly. You'll be very happy with yourself. Then you come back. In fact, you may get a birdie in a particular hole, and a birdie is when you get 1 under par. Mm-hmm. And then tomorrow you come and play it. You're like 4 over par. You're trying to replicate the success of the other day. And what I've learned is that you always have to approach every new set of 18 as a new challenge. It doesn't matter what you did last week on that course. It doesn't matter what you did the previous one. You have to show up fresh and literally take the challenge as a fresh one. So that's one thing I've learned, because I've played courses where I've performed well. I go back thinking today I'm going to do magic, and then it's off, Yeah. But the thing is, you still have to keep going. You have to be resilient. You still have to show up again. You don't get angry. You can, of course, get frustrated, but you keep showing. And
just because you did it yesterday.
Exactly. And I think it ties with the entrepreneurship journey, or startup journey. You cannot assume that, the fact that you perhaps succeeded in one place, that's going to be automatic. You need to be agile. You need to understand your market properly, and you just also have to keep being resilient and pushing through. So that's awesome. That's my take.
And it reminds me of that clip I watched of Samuel L. Jackson saying his friends ask him, how can you go play that same golf course every single day? Like, it's the same thing each time. Like, what's different? So it's always a different challenge. It's always a new challenge. You're different from day to day, but also the course is from very basic things like the winds are blowing differently, but also the course sometimes is changed, right? They'll move the hole, so you're approaching the green
spot,
exactly,
and they move the hole. So and there's it's not the same as
little differences, but it can throw you off. So I guess that adaptability and being agile. It's a great point. Thank you for that wisdom. What about this week? Have you learned or heard anything interesting that you wanted to share with our viewers, our listeners?
Yeah. This week, I was reminded.
Don't tell me another Black Swan event.
No, it wasn't a Black Swan event. but it is a reminder. As we were just discussing, actually, we mentioned about agreements and clarity. Yeah. The good thing about agreements, they bring clarity of expectations, or clarity of obligations and duties
Yeah.
and liabilities. So yeah, I got into a collaboration relationship, on some transaction we were supposed to do with a colleague. But then it was, I know you, you know me, word of mouth. Let's do this. Surprise, surprise. Along the way, there has been so much confusion on who is doing what and how. Such that when I look back at it, as we are both lawyers. It's funny how we did not really set out this.
Yeah.
So it's just a reminder that despite some of these things being basic, you need to always stick them. And I like taking borrowing lessons from how pilots do. They have checklists. Their business revolves a lot around checklist. Before you fly, there's a checklist. There's really a checklist for procedures. And because you've flown for maybe 10,000 hours or even 18,000 hours, you cannot assume the checklist. Say that I have a sense that how these things go. You have to still check it. So that's my lesson, that despite some things may look basic, especially because you feel like you've done a couple of things over time.
Yeah.
But it's always important to ensure that you check them. Yeah.
Very good lesson.
What lesson have you picked yourself?
Especially working with lawyers. So I guess I'll say, how many lawyers does it take to change a light bulb? Do you know?
Yeah, no, how many?
It depends.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I learned this week that was interesting.
Yep.
So AFCA, formerly, I guess I think they've rebranded. They used to be Africa Venture Capital Association. They're now the African Private Capital Association, which I guess makes sense. So it's not just VC, it's private equity, it's all private capital. So they are a Pan-African industry body promoting and enabling private investment in Africa. They recently released their Venture Capital in Africa 2023 report. So what happened in VC last year? They'll have a PE one as well. But so in terms of venture capital, there's just a few highlights that I wanted to just share with you. One, there was a downturn in VC investments generally. I mean, I think this was across the board, across the globe. It was more, macroeconomic effects, global wars, high interest rates, etc. But within Africa, there was a 30% drop from 2022 in terms of both deal volume and deal value. So, I mean, we'll see sort of what happens this year. Hopefully, it's a better year for VC investment across the continent. Total 603 deals, 603 deals last year. That representing $4.5 billion, which, if you can imagine, the US alone has had 144 billion in VC investment. So over 100 times the activity on the continent. So I think just shows that there's still so much room for growth within the continent, that we still represent such a small slice of the VC activity. West Africa attracted the most VC investment by deal volume. That's 26%. So a quarter of the entire continent's deal volume was West Africa, led by Nigeria with 19%. Deal value leading was South Africa. So I guess South Africa is seeing a resurgence. Deal making was concentrated in financial sectors. The financials was really huge. That was like 23%. The one that really stood out for me was climate-related ventures raised about 790 million in 2023, which is not a huge slice, but it shows that climate and clean tech and tech around climate, those types of investments are really hot right now. So even when we were at the Africa Tech Summit a couple of weeks ago, that was at the forefront. It was something that everyone's talking about. If you're investing in that area, it's really sexy right now. Everyone wants to talk to you. So if you are a startup in that space, people are looking to talk to you. But I guess also weighing whether or not that's you. Do you want to formulate your whole thesis around that, or is it just a cyclical trend? I don't know. I mean, I think we're moving into a time where climate change is more and more preeminent, and we're starting to see its effects. So I think it's something that's probably going to stick around. But at least for right now, it's a really hot button issue, and people are really looking at those types of investments on the continent. So
wonderful.
That's something that interesting that I saw, and I thought it was worth sharing.
Yeah, that's a good point that you learned there. Yeah, sure. I'll actually check that.
Please do
that report. It should be having very exciting data. I guess we can wrap up what basically this episode has been about. Basically, it was mostly about the setup structures that a startup can take, and some highlight on the pros and cons of the setup structures, the nuances that you need to be aware of, such as your ease of raising capital, compliance requirement, regulatory considerations. We also mentioned something about particular markets, what to consider, what to take into account, or what should be important to you around the jurisdiction. We've shared some lessons that we've learned in the week, as well as
also how to set up a company in Kenya.
Yes, exactly.
How
to set up a company in Kenya is a good example. Of course, maybe we will explore other jurisdictions, because of course the focus of the podcast is actually Africa wide. We would want to maybe have discussions around, and that was actually an apt example about the movement of private capital investments in Africa in general, which parts of Africa seem to be winning more, and how the trends are behaving, and how it's going. Yeah, so we hope that you've found, and of course we had wisdom from the course. Let us know what you think about what we shared. If there's a particular item you would want us to take a deep dive on, we would be happy to take that.
Comment, subscribe, share. See you next time.
See you. Bye.
Bye.